Young and the Restless spoilers, Shock Tuesday full update news August 27, 2024. The aftermath of the tragic accident involving Faith Newman and Lucy Romalotti had plunged Genoa City into a state of grief and shock. Community was still reeling from the news that Faith was clinging to life in the hospital, her condition critical, and her future uncertain. Meanwhile, Lucy, who had already begun to grasp the magnitude of her actions, was facing the consequences of her role in the catastrophe. Lucy had regained consciousness in the hospital, her body battered, but her mind tormented by the guilt of what had happened. The police had wasted no time in questioning her about the events leading up to the crash, and while she was likely to face a significant fine for her part in the tragedy, that was the least of her worries. The real punishment was the overwhelming sense of responsibility she felt for Faith's condition. As she lay in her hospital bed, tears streaming down her face, Lucy was consumed by the wish that she could somehow take Faith's place. The thought of living in a world where Faith might not survive was unbearable to her. Nick and Sharon, Faith's parents, were devastated, but their grief was tempered by an understanding of the pressures and challenges that came with being a teenager. They couldn't bring themselves to blame Lucy for what had happened, even though their daughter was fighting for her life. They knew all too well that teenagers often made poor decisions, and they recognized that Lucy had never intended for any of this to happen. But the tragedy that had unfolded was a stark reminder of how quickly things could go wrong, and how the consequences of those decisions could be devastating. Lucy's cries echoed through the hospital corridors, her sobs filled with regret and desperation. She kept repeating that she wished it had been her instead of Faith. She would give anything to trade places with her friend. The guilt was consuming her, and she couldn't see a way forward if Faith didn't make it. The doctors were doing everything they could. Faith's condition remained precarious, and the possibility of losing her was a constant, crushing weight on everyone who loved her. As Lucy struggled with her guilt, another drama was unfolding at the Abbott mansion. Jack Abbott, always a man of keen instincts, had started to grow suspicious of Allan, the man who had recently become a fixture in their lives. Allan, who had charmed his way into Tracy's heart and into the Abbott household, was not who he appeared to be. Jack had noticed how Allan seemed to be far too interested in the goings-on within the mansion, often seen poking around in places he had no business being. It was as if he was searching for something, or worse, plotting something. Jack's suspicions were not unfounded. Allan was indeed hiding something, though he was careful not to give himself away. His demeanor was always just right, calm, pleasant, and attentive to Tracy. But Jack knew better than to take things at face value. There was something about Allan that didn't sit right with him, and Jack was determined to find out what it was. Allan, however, was no fool. He was aware of Jack's growing wariness and took steps to cover his tracks. He made sure to keep his true intentions well hidden, masking his actions with a veneer of harmless curiosity. Every time Jack thought he might have caught Allan in something, the man would smoothly explain away his behavior, leaving Jack with nothing concrete to go on. But the nagging feeling that something was amiss only grew stronger. Jack's investigation into Allan was becoming more urgent. He knew that if Allan was up to something sinister, he needed to act before it was too late. The Abbott mansion had always been a sanctuary for the family, a place where they could feel safe and secure. The idea that someone might be trying to undermine them from within was intolerable to Jack. But how to prove it? Allan was a master at playing the role of the innocent, and without hard evidence, Jack couldn't simply throw him out without raising questions and causing distress, especially to Tracy, who had grown close to Allan. As days passed, Jack's resolve only strengthened. He was convinced that Allan was hiding something, and he would do whatever it took to protect his family. The Abbott family had faced threats before, and Jack had always stood as their protector. This time would be no different, even if the threat was coming from within their own walls. While Jack plotted his next move, the situation with Lucy and Faith weighed heavily on his mind as well. The connection between the two dramas was undeniable, the same sense of impending disaster, the same desperate need to protect the people he cared about. Jack couldn't help but feel a deep empathy for what Nick and Sharon were going through, and his heart ached for Lucy, who was clearly suffering under the weight of her guilt. But Jack knew that he couldn't afford to be distracted. If Allan was indeed a threat, he needed to be dealt with swiftly and decisively. The last thing Jack wanted was to wait until it was too late to act. And so he began to quietly gather information, speaking to people who might know more about Allan's past, carefully watching his every move within the mansion, and piecing together the puzzle that was this mysterious man. The hope was that Jack would uncover the truth before Allan could do any real damage. But the clock was ticking, and the longer Allan remained in the Abbott home, the greater the risk that something terrible could happen. Jack could only pray that his instincts were right and that he could expose Allan for who he really was, for it was too late. As for Lucy, the days ahead would be some of the hardest of her life. Whether Faith would survive was still unknown, and the guilt of having played a part in her friend's suffering was a burden that Lucy would carry with her for a long time. But in the end, what mattered most was that those who had been hurt by these events found a way to heal, and that justice, in whatever form it took, would be served.